We're now going to move to question and answer. And I think following up on what you've said, we had a question that came from Francis Pimenta and DEFRA. And she wanted to know, Nigel, how is it that these indicators relate to the CCC's progress indicators or the CCRA risk scores? And I know you're involved in the CCRA as well. So could you comment on that?
Okay, so quickly, they're a contribution to information that goes into a CCRA type risk assessment, in a sense. So they don't directly contribute to the risk scores on adaptation needs in the CCRA, but hopefully they'll be useful to give some idea of the pressures on development of new policies for adaptation and resilience. And in terms of well, as I said, they're not really indicators of how things are changing as we speak. They're indicators of what things might be like in the future. And that's really quite an important distinction. And I'm trying to work out, sort of live, how we would try and incorporate that idea within what we're doing at the moment. So we can't be using the monitoring sense, but they're more a direction of travel type indicator. But I'll definitely go away and think about how that might work more effectively.
Could I just jump in there, Nigel?
Yeah.
In terms of how I view them. So I think this gives us a better understanding of potential risks.
Yeah.
Different scenarios. And I think by better understanding the risk, we can look at what existing plans and actions are in place. Are they sufficient under these various different scenarios? And if not, what gaps there are and what extra we need to be doing. So I think both for the progress report, it gives us a better understanding in terms of the sufficiency of the current plans, but in terms of the actual risk assessment itself, we're looking at 3 different questions, and I think that would be really helpful to help inform or help our own analysis.
That's a really good way of framing it. Thanks.
One more question we received through registration was from Mike Steele at the Environment Agency, and he asks, can we use other indicators of climate change to better understand the unseen changes to inland flood risk? I think you had an indicator that included inland flood risk, Nigel, didn't you?
Yeah, I think the question probably relates more, again, to spotting trends over time, which is pretty difficult in such a noisy record as flood data. So I think that's a slightly different issue, but it's definitely one worth looking at, especially because one of the things that we've identified in the project is that changes in the future, the changes in risk may be quite very, very, very dramatic. So getting some idea of how we're heading in that direction would be really, really useful. Not quite sure what unseen aspects of changing flood risk might mean, but I think there's a lot of scope for thinking about how we can monitor changes in risk using a whole range of different indicators across space and time, because looking at one place and one indicator is probably not going to be enough. But when we're looking for trend, taking a broader perspective might be useful, and it might capture some of these more subtle things that I think are being talked about here.
Yeah, he was particularly, I guess, trying to figure out, what kind of indicators or proxies would be useful to kind of assess inland flood risk.
Yeah, one of the things is that big floods are rare, so maybe something looking at the smaller floods might give us more clues. We can look into our projections for the change in the future to see what we can learn about changes in big floods compared to small floods and what that might tell us about indicators.
Okay, thank you. And I've got a question here from Helen McIntyre from Public Health England. So she's interested in testing and evaluation of indicators. So I think her question is really about whether, I guess, the indicators can tell us something about adaptation, whether they can be used to monitor levels of adaptation.
It varies across sectors. So for example, the NHS heatwave indicator that we use is the number of times the NHS heatwave plan is activated with the current thresholds. So by looking at how that changes over time, it gives us some clues as to how those, what that implies for how effective the plans might be in the future, and whether those thresholds and the criteria for defining a heat wave might change. So I can see in some particular aspects, it does give us clues as to what the adaptation needs might be and what would happen if you were to change the adaptation requirements. That is possible for some of the indicators. I think one of the things that we've learned is that indicators are incredibly varied, depending very much on policy context and information available. And it is almost a sort of case-by-case basis, but some of them would be quite good at seeing, well, what happens if you did change your policy threshold and therefore the policy associated with that threshold? What would that imply for change in risk, and so on and so on? So it's definitely worth pursuing.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to some of the questions that have been posed here on the Q&A. I think the first one, I'll take it. It's about how closely tied weather and climate events is, how a deep social, environment, economic, cultural shifts, threats, opportunities from a global shift reflected in the research program. So as I announced in the beginning, the program has just started 2 projects that's looking at the governing of climate adaptation, one looking at care settings, another one at water. And so those projects will undertake a lot of that research. Maybe Nigel, you could take the next one by Mark. It'd be interesting to understand the level of engagement across the UK, including in devolved administrations, and how hazards prediction indicators relate to existing information on, for example, flood risk.
Yeah, okay. That's a very good question. Most of the engagement that we started took place during the course of last year, while many of the government departments were involved in Brexit planning. Yeah, whatever happened to that? So engagement was quite challenging. So we did a lot of it remotely. It's probably fair to say we haven't engaged as much with the devolved administrations as we would have liked, but we're still open for discussion. So anybody wants to send me some information about policy relevant thresholds and things that they're particularly concerned about, do let me know. In terms of floods, one of the things that are picked up, for example, was that the definitions of extreme flood risk vary between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So the thresholds there are geographically variable. The thresholds for heatwave plans vary, not least because Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland don't do things in the same way as England. So there's all sorts of differences across devolved administrations. So really like to find out, get some idea about things that are more relevant and more locally tunable. Okay, thank you. I've got a technical question now. Have you applied a bias correction method to the UKCP18 data? The quick answer is that essentially the delta method is a form of bias correction in the sense that we're applying delta changes from UKCP18 to observed climate. So we don't bias correct the UKCP18 data, we use the UKCP18 data to adjust the observations. I can expand on that offline in more detail if necessary. Okay. Fiona's got a question here. Are there any plans to report and update observations of what level indicators are currently alongside the projections? Could relevant indicators be included in State of the UK Climate Report? So I guess as part of the UK climate projections, there's an observation sort of trend report, and obviously you were talking a little bit about potentially putting some of this in a website where people could go and choose particular grid boxes and different warming levels and etc. Do you envisage that could be actually part of a sort of report on observations? We hadn't really thought about sort of observations and tracking, which is obviously something that's come up a lot over the last hour or so. I'll have to think about that, but in principle, it sounds a good idea. Can we use what we've learned in this project to identify things that will be relevant to track? But at the same time, is it possible to track and count those things? So I think there's a lot of scope, although within the little time available with this project, not feasible, but we can definitely pursue how these link in with observations, definitely. And I think that addresses one of the other questions that came up a bit later about validation. Okay.
Richard Betts really enjoyed the talk. Thanks, Richard. Thanks to Nigel. But he's got a question, in terms of, based on your previous experience, are these findings kind of, significantly different from what from previous projections? I guess UKCP09 and things that have happened before that, or is this kind of reinforcing previous work?
This is some general points about that question. I think the UKCP18 projections are a bit warmer with the higher emissions, so therefore I'd anticipate these results to be more extreme than previously. Haven't done a comparison, and that not doing the comparison is relevant, because quite often we're asked, how does this compare with what was done last time? And when we do this sort of analysis, and we've done this globally as different projects, you rarely repeat what you did before. You update it with more information, with better indicators, with better this. So you never repeat what you did before with previous scenarios. So it's often difficult to say what's the difference between what this and what was done 5 years ago, because the approach taken 5 years ago was different, the indicators are different. And that's an issue. I'm not quite sure how to address that, because I was thinking, could we just crank the handles and repeat this with UKCP09? And that's a non-trivial task, because the data are in a different format. So that's an issue about, how is this different to what we thought before? There are lots of things that are different, and I'm not sure how we address that in a research program. That's something to think about.
Okay, and I think I'll take one final question from Charles, which is a very interesting one. Are there any indicators that have jumped out in this research as key concerns, but where observational data is currently limited, and therefore would be beneficial to start collecting, such as so that we can actually so the stakeholders can measure progress in adapting to risks?
The things that have cropped up as being really quite high profile things that might change in the future are associated with hot spells. This is not surprising. So things like counting the number of times NHS heatwave plans are activated, or there are adverse weather days on the railway, or things like that would be really quite helpful, I think, to give some idea of how the change in these indicators is affecting things in practice. So I would say that the heat related ones, there's quite a lot on flood stuff already, but the various heat related ones I think are particularly high profile, and we don't really have public domain information on how these things are changing. There may be good reasons for that, which is probably more of a bit of a generic issue. So some of the heat wave related things I think are much more are very problematic, and we can start collecting things now. Some of them, there probably is information, but separating out the climate effect from other drivers might be challenging. I'm thinking about wildfires, for example. There's much better information on wildfires, but separating out the climate on the weather signal from other signals is really, really challenging on that. Whereas for things that are more activated by temperature thresholds, it might work more effectively.
Okay. Thank you, Nigel. Brendan, do you have any final comments on some of these questions?
No, I think just in terms of the links with the reporting on how this can help us report on the CCRA, I think it'll be really helpful just in terms of linking or getting a better understanding of the hazards in the future and the different scenarios under which this may change. It'll help us more in terms of answering the questions as to is the correct policy in place, are the correct actions being taken, and what gaps there are that need to be filled.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel and Brendan, for a very stimulating talk and discussion. It just leaves me to advertise now our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time. So Dr. Freya Gary, who's a climate scientist at the Met Office, will talk to us about how multiple climate hazards impact UK food over the 21st century. You can see more details on the website and the program for the whole webinar series there as well. And do follow us on Twitter, and if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll also get news about the program. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully see you all in 2 weeks' time. And thanks in particular to Nigel and Brendan for participating. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
so much.
Bye.
Bye.